The ACLU sues over a higher education bill. Jim Banks attends Trump VP auditions, plus study committee agendas unveiled, and more. From the television studios at WFYI, it's Indiana Week in Review for the week ending May 17th, 2024.
Indiana Week in Review is made possible by the supporters of Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations.
The ACLU of Indiana is suing Purdue over a state law passed this year that many academics say dismantles tenure. WFIU's Ethan Sandweiss reports.
Senate Enrolled Act 202 makes it possible for university trustees to revoke and punish professors if they fail to expose students to material from, quote, a variety of political or ideological frameworks. The plaintiffs are two professors at Purdue University, Fort Wayne. They say the new requirements violate their First and 14th Amendments. The law supporters say it will only require professors to teach material with academic merit, but professors such as litigant Steve Carr fear its ambiguity would require them to give debunked theories equal time in the classroom.
We want public higher education to constantly be looking over our its shoulders, because we fear that someone else is watching what we teach in the classroom.
ACLU lawyer Stevie Proctor explains why their suit is against the Purdue Board of Trustees.
And the way that this type of civil rights litigation works is that you have to sue the entity that's responsible for enforcing the law. And here, the statute requires that the universities and colleges be the enforcers of the law.
The legislation drew protests from universities across the state. IU President Pamela Whitten denounced the bill. Purdue spokesperson Tim Doty declined to comment on the lawsuit.
What impact could this lawsuit have? It's the first question for our Indiana Week in Review panel. Democrat Ann DeLaney, Republican Chris Mitchem, John Schwantes, host of Indiana Lawmakers, and Kayla Dwyer, state government and politics reporter for the Indianapolis Star. I'm Indiana Public Broadcasting State House Bureau Chief Brandon Smith. Chris Mitchem, obviously this is a very hypothetical question at this point, but if this law is struck down or in any way enjoined, how do you think lawmakers might react to that?
I don't think they'll be surprised, first of all. Typically what it's kind of standard for ACLU going forward of all these different lawsuits. But I certainly think there would be a response from lawmakers if this, for whatever reason, were to be enjoined, simply because the environment which the bill was passed earlier this year, I mean, if you look at college campuses, it's only kind of gotten inflamed, right, with all of these different protests and things like that. So I certainly think there would be another crack at it if something were to enjoin this particular bill. But I have a hard time believing it would be struck down, simply because I have a hard time personally of even finding standing here. I mean, both of the plaintiffs kind of gave specific examples of things that they think they would be forced to teach for the sake of intellectual diversity and things like that. But if you read the bill, and we keep mentioning the K through 12 bill from a couple years ago that actually said what you can and can't teach, this bill doesn't do that. It doesn't say you can't teach this, you can't teach this. It just tries to mandate that you have a variety different of viewpoints, right? So, and the bill also kind of puts a lot of the leverage onto the Board of Trustees of saying, hey, you set the curriculum, and then if the professor tends to go out of their way of this curriculum, then that's when you can act and things like that. I was talking to lawmakers just a couple days ago, and they kind of gave the example of this bill actually protects a professor who would want to go up and maybe join arms with some of these students at these encampments or something like that. That wasn't in
They're already
code.
Protected.
Or that wasn't in code before.
It was in state law before.
Right. But it protects that.
We don't normally have two scholars of law sitting in these seats, so I want to kind of dig into the lawsuit question here that he just brought up, which is, even before this lawsuit, when the law was passed, there were a lot of questions about how universities, whether or not it would actually do much of anything, and whether universities would enforce it in the way that people certainly feared during the legislative process. Is this lawsuit a little premature? I
don't think so. I think this particular piece of legislation, like many passed by the Indiana General Assembly, is a statement. They want to state that, kids are being brainwashed in college. For decades, for hundreds of years, professors have studied their fields, designed their curriculum, taught the students, voted basically on who gets hired and who gets fired and all of these particular questions. All of a sudden, the Indiana General Assembly is going to tell them what they need to say and what they can't say. And it comes at you from both directions. You know, academic merit. What in God's name is academic merit? Okay? In Florida, it means having somebody teach that blacks were actually advantaged by being slaves. I mean, that's what's so ridiculous about this. The First Amendment not only protects what professors can say, it protects professors from being compelled to say. Okay? And we've gone through this before with legislation over religious freedom as to whether you have to say the Pledge of Allegiance and those kinds of things. But this is an example of them trying to restrict the First Amendment. It's a solution in search of a problem. I mean, the one thing universities do is teach students to think. You disagree with the professor? Put your hand up and say so. Okay? Everybody does that in college. But
and there were processes in place
and there are
for
processes
that.
if you think something is wrong. But the General Assembly needs to stay out of it because they don't know what they're doing, and it's going to be unconstitutional.
To the question of whether the Indiana General Assembly will, in your words, stay out of it, to Chris's point, this law was passed before what we've seen over the last few weeks on college campuses across the country, including here in Indiana, with these protests and criticism over the way universities have responded to those. But we've seen conservative leaders who have been expressed anger with specifically IU in the past, like Jim Banks, now praising their reaction to these protests. Do you think that has, at the State House at least, sort of calmed down Republican leaders who maybe weren't happy with how universities were conducting themselves?
Oh, I mean, I think first of all, to the original question, we might see this play out in the court for some time, and we might not even, they often will say like, oh, we're not going to do much because things are in the court. So much of the future reaction next session is going to depend on what the national conversation is, what the status of that court case is, and so it's just almost too hard to predict what they're going to do come January.
Do you now will potentially have universities in the position of defending a law that they don't like here? Do you not, John?
Yeah, but that doesn't let the university administrations off the hook, I think. Now, while IU certainly had denounced this bill early on, the administration at Purdue had not. It was quiet throughout.
Yes, very, very quiet.
And that was noted. But then you have other ACLU litigation, which is moving forward now, too, related to campus free speech issues and the role of the campus police in removing protesters or in barring preemptive ban on protest or banning people from campus, as has been done. So there's a lot of blame to go around. I don't think the universities have acted with great purity. It hasn't been one of the better chapters, I don't think. And as far as the issue of, you're right about a statement, but there's not always a knowledge that goes with making a statement. Back when Senate Bill 202 was first signed, just out of curiosity, I went and I looked, must have had some spare time, to see how many members who had voted in the House and Senate for that legislation had any degrees either at the undergraduate level or graduate level from one of the 7 institutions that would be affected by this.
Mm-hmm. How many?
It was barely 50%, barely 50%. So half of the people who supported that bill essentially were relying on hearsay or what they think happens at Indiana and Purdue and Ball State and Indiana State, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, only thing I'd add to that is to your point about the other lawsuits. I think if you had a lawsuit that was potentially criticizing or trying to sue a teacher for going and joining on one of these encampments, that's where you run into trouble, right? Yeah. Because that's your own political thing. But I think what SB 202 is trying to do is saying that whenever you take those beliefs into the classroom and then say, this is why I was doing it, it's fact, and you're not giving any other background as to what the other side is, and there's been examples of professors doing that in Indiana, unfortunately, that's where it empowers the Board of Trustees to try.
But the problem is who's to say what the right side is.
I'm not saying what's right or wrong, it's just you have to do both sides.
No, you don't have to do both sides.
No, I don't think there is.
You don't have to say that blacks were advantaged.
No, there are issues where there isn't.
That's an outrage.
You don't have to say the
some issues, I think even conservative Republicans would say there are some issues where there is a clear right and there clear is an answer. And as soon as you start introducing the other side or this notion that everything is a matter of relevance, equal relevance, and you can have flat world, yes, flat world, no.
Creationism, not evolution. You can
My
have it
example
all.
of today, when it comes to the whole Israeli-Palestinian thing right there is not a right or wrong answer there. We all agree that's a gray area that
Right,
takes
so you debate both.
And you
but you don't
present both
tell the
sides.
professor what he can say and can't say.
But you
and
present
make
both
sure,
sides.
No,
you don't take it as gospel if you're in the field and say this is why it
You cannot make somebody who
is.
believes one way discuss or advocate for a different position. You can have a different
And you don't have to
professor do that.
advocate.
Oh, yeah,
You have to
do.
present it. That's what the bill says.
Yeah,
It
okay.
says you can't use your own political things.
Academic merit, too.
Right. You
That's
don't have to
why
say
it's
what's
too
right and
vague
wrong.
to even enforce.
Well, I'll look forward to those arguments playing out in court over the next several months. Former President Donald Trump likely won't announce his choice of running mate for weeks, but he's been holding auditions, and Indiana Congressman Jim Banks recently attended one such event. The Republican National Committee held its spring meeting at Trump's Florida residence, Mar-a-Lago, and Trump held a private fundraising lunch that was largely viewed as a running mate audition. It included some of the most widely speculated candidates for the slot, including Governors Kristi Noem and Doug Burgum, Senators J.D. Vance, Tim Scott, and Marco Rubio, and Representatives Elise Stefanik and Byron Donalds. Indiana Congressman and U.S. Senate candidate Jim Banks attended the private event, though he told WBOI a few days later there is zero chance he'll be Trump's pick, and said he's focused on being Trump's backup in the U.S. Senate. Ann DeLaney, I know you're a big fan of Jim Banks, but
I think it'd be great if he was.
Yeah, would it make sense to send
It would
him
make
running?
perfect sense because he'd be off the ballot in Indiana. That would be great. I mean, it could be just analogous to what.
Well, he'd be on the ballot in Indiana.
Well, but not for Senate.
Yeah.
Not for Senate. So he'd be terrific. But, when you look at the list of people they had at that for potential candidates, and you think to yourself, all of them are Trump clones. I mean, all they need to do is learn to scream and lie and cheat a little bit more, and they could be Trump. None of them bring really much of anything to the table. I mean, the electoral votes in North and South Dakota, for example. Mario Rubio, I wasn't sure he was still with us. Marco Rubio, excuse me.
Hey, he's
I didn't think he was still with us.
Still a senator from Florida?
He's not shot his dog or his goat. So there are
Yeah,
some,
well, there are some
He's got
advantages.
the advantage.
as far as I know.
Yeah, they're not. I mean, if you're serious about those candidates, terrific.
It does seem like Jim Banks is a long shot, but you can see why it would make sense. He's been a strong supporter of Donald Trump. Donald Trump has backed him in,
And he
in
brings
multiple
Indiana?
races. Well, but I mean, the same argument could have been made for him picking Mike Pence in 2016.
Well,
but
no, but Mike Pence brought the conservative Christians with him. That's not something Jim Banks is bringing with
Well,
him.
Jim Banks absolutely would bring conservative Christians to the table.
More so
They're
than
all-
other
we're all
candidates.
done
More
with
so than
that.
other candidates. He is a darling of
Is he?
the conservative Christian movement. But is the fact that he's from Indiana going to scare Donald Trump off a little bit?
It's like he already used that tactic, right? And it won kind of in 2016, not so much 2020, but
Well, he didn't actually win.
I think it.
Well, he won in
The popular
2016.
vote.
Oh, the popular.
Oh, okay.
Well, that
That's
doesn't really
true.
matter. Doesn't really matter.
But I think the days of, especially in this particular environment, the days of finding a candidate that gives you an edge in this one or this state, I mean, it's tough because whoever you pick, you're going to alienate somebody. I mean, and I'm actually agreeing with Ann here of saying that Jim Banks, I think, would actually be a pretty good candidate simply because he doesn't have as many national headlines as these other people do. So kind of taking somebody that you know is going to be in your corner, is a staunch conservative, and you can kind of mold his national image, right? Because we hear about him all the time in Indiana. If you were to ask people here, we'd think he'd be a global superstar, but he's not. So I think picking him, somebody who, again, you know who's on his side, and you can mold would actually be potentially a pretty good choice.
To that end, again, it seems unlikely Jim Banks will be the pick, although I'm never going to predict anything that Donald Trump is going to do. And it does seem like Donald Trump is going to make this decision more than anyone else. But it doesn't seem like Banks will be the pick. But how much does this elevate his profile regardless?
Well, it helps him, I'm sure. I mean, people want to be seen in the party who have a certain viewpoint, want to be seen in and around the glow of Donald Trump. Look at the people outside court this week that basically served as his proxies to.
I think just about every VP candidate that was mentioned has been to
New York.
Yeah, either New York or these fundraisers. I mean, there are numerous auditions. This was one. So to that extent, I'm sure it checks a box. Oh, yeah, for those who had any doubts, not that they did, about Jim Banks and his affinity for Donald Trump, this certainly took care of it. But, I mean, I don't think it makes or breaks his career. I mean, by aligning himself in this way. It doesn't hurt, but And he probably would be a fine candidate. It's just that the Indiana thing might.
Yeah,
I mean,
might be.
to go back to the well now, that would be not just 2 times, 3 times if you
Yes,
bring
Quayle into it.
Dan Quayle into it.
I want to ask on the larger VP search for Donald Trump. Even with Joe Biden picking Kamala Harris, there was still an element of who's Joe Biden going to pick, who's going to help him, whether with a state or certain constituencies.
Right.
Do all of those sorts of standard questions about a running mate fly out the window because it almost doesn't matter with Donald Trump?
Yeah, I mean, my first thought in terms of that interest of balance or appealing to other people within the party, unification, would be Nikki Haley. But I don't know that Trump is...
No, that seems unlikely.
Yeah, and I don't know that Trump is interested in reconciliation within the party. I think he's about MAGA.
And that's an important question, though. I mean, that he brings the moderate Republicans who maybe get tired of Donald Trump on board, and particularly because, you know, everybody talks about Joe Biden's age. Donald Trump isn't far behind,
like a
and he's
couple
been
years younger.
rode hard and put away with a lot of times. So he may not be with us if he does, unfortunately, win another term. And that makes the vice presidential candidate more important. And it seems to me it shouldn't be a clone of him. It should be somebody that can talk to the people who feel basically feel that they're not Republicans anymore because of him.
I would think picking Nikki Haley, there's a chance that you might alienate your base. But I mean, with Trump, I feel like if you just bring her on stage and be like, you know, this is my option, you know, I think
It doesn't matter. There's almost nothing you can do.
The
You just kind of
question
act
is,
that concerned
would
very
she
quickly.
do it?
Everybody else is on board.
All right,
see
time
that
now.
happen.
Yeah, I'm not sure she would. Time now for viewer feedback. Each week we pose an unscientific online poll question, and this week's question is: would Indiana Congressman Jim Banks be a good choice as Donald Trump's running mate? A, yes, or B, no. Last week's question was who will win the race for Indiana governor. 36% of you say Republican Mike Braun, 61% say Democrat Jennifer McCormick, and 3% say Libertarian Donald Rainwater. 3% being usually about the percentage Libertarians get on the ballot, although Rainwater was a notable example last time. If you'd like to take part in the poll, go to WFYI.org/IWIR and look for the poll. Well, Indiana lawmakers will explore school absenteeism, artificial intelligence, and homeowners associations, among other issues, during this year's legislative study committees. Study committee agendas are voted on by the 4 State House caucus leaders, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. A topic needs at least 3 votes to be studied. The committees have generated far fewer recommendations and proposed legislation in recent years. House Speaker Todd Houston says he's urging his members to consider what they're trying to accomplish through study committees.
What needs to be done in this format, what can be done just by members doing other work, so that it isn't, frankly, a waste of time, but that something of value comes out of it.
One topic not on the study committee agenda is cannabis. Senate GOP leader Roderick Bray says lawmakers have delved into the issue the past 2 years.
It's not to say, however, that there won't be some people looking at that over the summer.
Study committees, which are open to the public, will begin meeting in the next few months. John Schwantes, do study committees tell us much about future legislative sessions anymore?
Well, they used to. I mean, it used to be, and I'm talking 10, 20 years ago, if there was a study committee, you could basically assume, start mocking up the enrolled act because it was probably...
And in some cases, they literally had mocked up enrolled acts.
Yes, they did. And I don't know, that's not the case now, clearly. I mean, we've seen any number of issues in study committees in the past 8 years where it's almost as if the tree fell in that summer forest and nobody heard it, and it was ignored completely. So there's a change. Now, I don't know if that is because of sort of the lack of uniformity or conformity within the caucuses, because, at a time you could say, well, leadership, and it's the 4 leaders, caucus leaders who decide on these, they control, they really know where their caucuses are, and they have a pretty good gut sense of where they want this to end up, and this is the bill. Now, at that time, you had people more in lockstep. Now you have...
Well, you had to be because it was so much closer.
Well, right. Now when you
didn't have supermajorities.
I've always said I feel sorry for the leadership of supermajorities because that's harder to manage than probably anything, because you have so many, especially now, you have so many factions within, for instance, the Republican Party in terms of those hard to the right and those that are a little bit more moderate, and so it's not as easy to act in unison, and So I think that may be the change, but no, I don't know that you can read as much into it now as you would have in the past.
One thing that does seem certain to come up that they've been studying now, this will be the second year, is the SALTER task force, as they call it, the State and Local Tax Review Task Force, where they're looking to maybe in some ways remake Indiana's tax code. The notable thing there seemed to be that they've added a lot more granular property tax issues to the agenda this summer. When we asked Rod Bray about it, he said, whether that was foretelling what was going to come out of that task force. He kind of hedged a little bit, but he did seem to say that property taxes are what a lot of folks are hearing about, right?
Yeah, and when they started that SALT task force, I think income tax was top of mind, but we've sort of realized through being on campaign trails, and I mean lawmakers, of course, over the election year, this past year, voters are mostly talking about property taxes, is what they're feeling the most acutely. But I think arriving at what the right solution is, it has been a more difficult task than they thought. So they just decided they need to study that more. But that definitely seems to be where the talking points are headed.
All right.
Yeah, I think they're going to also have to discuss the gas tax. I mean, between electric vehicles and getting much better mileage, they're going to need to have some debate.
That's a separate task force, which is the road funding task force.
And that may advance as well.
And it wasn't too long ago when personal property taxes was the big talking point of the legislature. So they're putting a lot of stake into that committee in particular. Just almost every committee you hear now is, well, we'll talk about that in the interim committee. Like that's actually one you should probably pay attention to.
Almost missed the auto excise tax. Back when you had a tax, you could just set your bullseye on, put a bullseye on, shoot it down.
Well, we talked a little bit about Nikki Haley already. While former President Donald Trump easily won Indiana's Republican presidential primary last week, Nikki Haley garnered about 22% of the vote, despite the fact that she dropped out of the race 2 months earlier before Hoosiers even started voting. Political scientist Laura Merrifield Wilson cautions against reading too much into these results.
This could be at least in part a result of the crossover voting, and Democrats who looked at the Democratic ballot and saw the race for Senate, but otherwise no real incentive to necessarily vote in their primary, and instead took the Republican ballot.
Haley did best in Indianapolis and its northern suburbs, areas where Democrats are hoping to capitalize in the fall in races further down the ballot.
For the Democratic Party, and certainly those Democratic candidates with races in those counties and in the surrounding areas, it does provide maybe a sense of hope and opportunity that this isn't necessarily die-hard Trump country.
Wilson says the primary results will have no effect on the presidential race in Indiana, where Trump is almost guaranteed to win easily. Kayla Dwyer, do you think Haley's 22% will mean anything come November?
I'm skeptical that this is much more than an interesting thing to note rather than something that'll actually affect races down ballot. I mean, if anything, you might think it would affect, say, state house races in the suburbs, because that's where she performed best. But even then, I mean, we just had a municipal election a couple months ago, or 6 months ago, and Carmel Fisher's Republicans did really well. So, this is still very much a Trump state. And also, we don't have any way of knowing how many people at the ballot box just didn't realize she wasn't on the ballot anymore, technically, or wasn't in the race anymore.
Yeah, you can't rule that out, certainly. In terms of the potential for the down ballot impact in November, particularly in Boone and Hamilton County, where she did the best, and you have some competitive state house races, certainly ones that Democrats are targeting, is the biggest bulwark against any impact straight ticket voting? You press one button and that takes care of the ballot.
Press buttons.
Well, whatever one does. I remember levers. But yes, your point is well taken.
You take one action,
yes,
and therefore solve all of your problems.
You punch one Chad.
We don't have Chads, thank you.
No, but yes, I think that does have a big impact. And I think if you had removed, straight ticket voting, you would have a lot of interesting outcomes. They wouldn't all be the obvious one, such as, you'd see more Democrats popping up in the suburban counties, perhaps around as victors. In Indianapolis, you'd probably see more Republicans in other parts of the state that are,
both ways.
It's just be the reverse. So, but again, is that going to happen?
Should Republicans be concerned at all about how well Nikki Haley did in Boone and Hamilton counties?
I don't think so, because I think since 2016, we have enough evidence that shows that those people just really don't like Trump. I think the Republicans still do well enough. You're going to have your 2 occasional close races, but I mean, Noblesville, Westfield, you're still seeing Republicans win by 20 points, even since then.
But you know, I do think it has an impact, or could have an impact, on the down ballot races. And the other part of that I think is interesting is I think there are a number of Republicans who would classify themselves as moderate who have said enough. Mm-hmm. And it's not going to be the gubernatorial that's going to be the break here. They spent almost $100 million on that race, and their turnout was anemic. Nobody was running to the poll because they were enthused about Mike Braun or any of the other ones.
Sometimes the opposite.
Exactly the opposite. So that, and you know, like Victoria Sparks, she got the lowest percentage vote of any incumbent running in the entire country.
Yeah. Well, that was 9 candidates or something?
Well,
on the ballot? That has an
she
impact.
still was the incumbent, and she was on TV all the time.
That's true. All right, that's Indiana Week in Review for this week. Our panel is Democrat Ann DeLaney, Republican Chris Mitchem, John Schwantes of Indiana Lawmakers, and Kayla Dwyer of the Indy Star. You can find Indiana Week in Review's podcasts and episodes at WFYI.org/IWIR or on the PBS app. I'm Brandon Smith of Indiana Public Broadcasting. Join us next time, because a lot can happen in an Indiana week.
The opinions expressed are solely those of the panelists. Indiana Week in Review is a WFYI production in association with Indiana's public broadcasting stations.